Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to get started. Thank you all for coming to my presentation. For those who I haven't met before, my name is Andrew Case. I'm the Director of Research at Volatility, where we get to deal with very interesting threat actors and some of the most sophisticated exploits that cross the wire. And I'm also one of the core developers of Volatility, and I've been involved with it since about 2010, 2011. For today, in case you missed it, we just had a huge release of Volatility 3, where we replaced the entirety of Volatility 2. So this was not just taking Volatility 2 and making it work with Python 3. This was a complete rewrite from the first line of code. Volatility itself, the original one, was architected back in around 2008, and things have changed quite a bit since then, right? Machines went from 1 gig of RAM to quite a bit of RAM. Investigations went from investigating 1 or 2 machines to where now we are routinely looking at hundreds, thousands of machines very quickly. And so that old design of Volatility kind of fell apart. And then there was also a bunch of features that people wanted as investigations matured that we kind of hacked into Volatility 2, but we wanted as really first-class features of Volatility 3. So this slide's actually, the bottom one's actually outdated because it has been replaced now. If you go to GitHub for Volatility 2, it is read-only, it's archived. Volatility 3 can do everything Volatility 2 could do, plus support all the new operating systems, as well as have a bunch of new features. And for the talk today, what I really wanted to focus on, instead of showing the old plugins in new form, is really focus on the new stuff. Before I jump into that, if you haven't seen memory forensics before or you haven't got to do it yourself, the reason we care about it so much, the reason we've dedicated essentially our professional lives to memory forensics and keeping the research going and the tools going, is when you're dealing with sophisticated threats, when you're dealing with nation-state groups, and realistically, even when you're dealing with some ransomware that's written well, the data that you're looking for, the malicious code, the malicious data, the real IOCs, those are only in memory. So if your version of incident response, or what I call forensics, is to get a network capture, that doesn't work. Everything's encrypted, it's custom protocols. If you try to look on the file system, there's nothing there either. And you've probably heard of fileless malware. That is not what I'm talking about here. Fileless malware is malware that exists inside a file on disk that is not an executable or a DLL. So it will infect a shortcut file, or it will write itself inside of the registry. But with fileless malware, the idea is you can turn that machine off, get the hard drive, and go find the malware. The stuff we're looking at today is memory-only malware. And when I say memory-only, it means it's truly only in RAM. So if you walk up to that machine and you turn it off to go do forensics in your lab, that malware, that evidence you're looking for, is gone forever. And essentially 99% of investigations we do, either the entire payload is memory only, or the stuff that we actually need to know about is memory only. At the bottom is one of my favorite reports ever, and this is not a plug for Volatility, it's a report from Microsoft. I had nothing to do with the report, but it is an incredible read. So if core lump, if that malware doesn't mean anything to you, go read the report after. Basically what Microsoft did is they realized there was this company that existed, I won't say the country, go read the report, but it was a company that was a hacker for hire company that had very sophisticated tool sets. And Microsoft found these tool sets at some of their customers that they were doing security work for, and Microsoft wrote this incredible report that just burned that infrastructure to the ground, like truly top-notch work. And the reason I call out this one small snippet of it is it's talking about the main payload, which Microsoft called core lump, and it's saying how it existed only in memory. And then the capabilities the malware had that were memory only. So not a single trace on the file system were things like key logging, monitoring the webcam, monitoring the microphone, taking screenshots, exfiltrating files, everything you could want to do to stalk someone, for espionage. Nothing exists on disk. So again, you have to do memory forensics. And then literally last week, you can see up here, May 28th, there was another really good report from Google's threat intelligence team called APT41 Innovative Tactics. If you didn't see this in the last 5 or 6 days, go read it as well. But it was talking about this new malware from a very sophisticated threat group, and the idea was the malware that mattered, the main payloads, again, were all memory only. And it talks about here how it does process hollowing on service host and how it existed in all these environments with EDRs present, and obviously the EDRs didn't see it. If you haven't heard of process hollowing, you're in the right room. You're going to learn about it today. You're going to see the plugin that detects it, and this is exactly why we do memory forensics. And then the other thing, which for a long time, go back to 2010, 2011, 2012, we were trying to convince people, hey, you need to do memory forensics, that's where the malware is. But it was always us talking at conferences like this or doing trainings, and slowly we got people moving there. What really helped us out is within the last few years, CISA has what's known as emergency directives. So the idea here is when there's a major outbreak, when certain malware is being spread or certain vulnerabilities are being exploited at scale, CISA can do emergency directives that tells basically every federal and state agency, hey, you have to respond in this way, and this is how you have to respond to it basically immediately. And because of the prevalence where in these directives, they have the IOCs those agencies are supposed to look for. But when you look at their reports, 99% of those IOCs are only in memory. So you can't even check if your machine's infected unless you're doing memory forensics in the first place. So what I have highlighted in red is directly from one of their reports. This is what they all look like now. It's section 1, step 1. The very first thing to do is get a memory sample, because otherwise you're just throwing away your best evidence. So we have a lot of motivation now, and many places are doing memory forensics. And like I said, with Volatility 3, we wanted to be able to catch all the malware that's out there. Traditional code injection techniques, we're going to spend all of one slide reviewing those just to kind of stage the later stuff. But your traditional code injection techniques are pretty noisy to volatility. They're pretty noisy to your EDRs. Any decent like commercial EDR would catch them. So there's not a whole lot of point in using them. Now I know EDRs can be bypassed. We'll talk about that later. But in the default state, you don't want to use these techniques. And because these techniques were so common, this is what Volatility 2 really focused on. We didn't have plugins in Volatility 2 to detect the newer stuff because we were spending all our time getting Volatility 3 to where it could replace Volatility 2. So for the rest of the talk, what we basically want to look at is super sophisticated and fun malware, the stuff you really see in the wild, and that your EDRs and other processes you might be using aren't going to detect, but with our open source tool, you can detect them right away. Before we can do that, we just need a couple of slides of background, some terms, and to get everyone on the same page. The first thing we need to talk about are virtual address descriptors, which are always called VADs, because that's a lot of information to say. These are extremely important because they tell us inside of a particular process what memory looks like. And so if malware is injecting itself into a process so that it can perform its keystroke logging or monitor the webcam, we need to be able to find that memory, examine that memory for signs of malware. So for each region, we'll see this more on the next slide, but for each region of memory inside that process, it's going to give us very important metadata. So it's going to tell us, as you can see in the plugin, the protections of that region, which addresses it's holding, and so on. And then if it's mapping a file on disk, it's going to tell us where that is. So inside this process, this is the VAD info plugin with Volatility. If you've never seen it before, there are very purpose-built plugins that do one thing. And so with VAD info, you're saying for the processes you care about, this is the data you want to see. You want to see the memory regions, so in this case, read write, execute write copy, is it mapping a file, which address is it at, and so on. And this is going to be a key building block to detect basically every type of code injection out there, because there's some invariance here. So with Windows, and I have them highlighted in blue, but you have to remember these, or the rest of the talk's going to be a little bit rough. If you have a memory region hosting code that is legitimate, so it's a regular application you write with Visual Studio, or you run some legitimate software off the internet, memory regions that are hosting code should have two attributes. One is their protection here, should be page execute write copy. You're going to hear me say that term a lot. And then also it should map a file on disk. And basically what that's saying is the regions that are hosting code should be mapped through a legitimate API versus code injection, which is what we want to detect out in the wild, does the code manipulation, the code writing, the code execution all on its own to try to bypass EDRs and other sensors. And those regions will potentially not be execute write copy, and they probably don't map a file. So with just those two invariants, remembering those two things, we're going to catch the vast majority of malware out there. The other thing we want to be able to do is know specifically which DLLs the operating system thinks is loaded into a process. You can see here quickly this process has kernel32.dll, ntdll user32. DLLs are what hold your repeatable code. This is what's holding your APIs. And in general, what you would expect is something like load library to be called and then get that DLL into a process. So then again, inside that process's memory is the executable, and it can be referenced to be used. Internally, how this is stored, the important thing here is this. So inside the kernel for every process, there's some addresses that point down into process memory. So you end up here. So you have your process in kernel mode, the PEB, which you've probably heard of if you've done shellcode analysis or anything like that. This is inside of process memory, so it is freely manipulatable and readable by malware running inside the process. But off the PEB are 3 lists that hold all the DLLs that are loaded. So through legitimate means, you call load library, you give it a path on disk, it loads the DLL into the process. You would expect it to look something like this, where every DLL is referenced by 3 different lists. Now, if you're an antivirus engine, or you're an EDR, or you're a debugger, your Ollie debug, your WinDebug, whatever it might be, and you use the legitimate API, you call the API that Windows gives you that says which DLLs are loaded in a process, it's going to walk this first one. It's going to walk this one here, the load order list, and then you're going to get the list of DLLs loaded legitimately into a process. Volatility does that same exact thing with the DLL list plugin. We walk those data structures, walk that first list, and now you see them loaded. And with this information, knowing what VAD should look like, remember page execute, write copy, map a file, and the fact that if you dynamically load code into a process, it should be in the form of a DLL that shows up in this plugin. We can do a bunch of automated cross comparisons on those invariants, and all the malware is going to pop out right away. You obviously could kind of look at this on your own, but why do that if you can automate it? The traditional techniques that I mentioned before, we're going to cover in one slide, is the remote DLL injection. So I mentioned before, malware that persists on disk is super boring. That's like from 20 years ago, no one does that, and attacks that matter. So in what's known as remote DLL injection, you have a DLL on disk, you call load library on it, but then it shows up here, and it shows up on the live system if you don't hook the API. So if you see a reference to remote DLL injection, that is taking a DLL on disk and injecting it into a victim process. But that gets detected by EDRs, and you just saw where volatility would detect it as well. A variant of this is, let's say we don't want an entire DLL. We just want to write some shell code, so some raw code, inject it into a process. We can do that as well, and then get that code to execute. But as you're going to see in a second, that is really weird, right? Because it's not even backed by a file. So with these traditional techniques where we load a DLL from disk, we saw how to catch that with DLL list. If we have shell code where we're essentially just throwing code into memory and getting it executed, that's where malfind comes into play. So for any type of shell code injection using the traditional techniques, you run malfind, it's going to find it right away. In this case, we're finding plug X. So the RAS-TLS process is saying, hey, there's a memory region that's page execute, read, write. That doesn't make sense. It has all the bits set. Code should be not writable, and data shouldn't be executable. And then furthermore, it's pointing out the fact that there's shellcode at this region. So again, without looking at VAD info yourself, you run one plugin, and the shellcode pops out right away. Something else that attackers still use very frequently is what's known as reflective DLL injection. So I mentioned before, if you have a DLL on disk, you're basically wasting your time. You're not a very good attacker, right? You want to do everything memory only. So with reflective DLL injection, this is where you say, I want the power of a DLL. I don't want to have to write my whole payload in shellcode, which is pretty rough. I want a regular DLL, but I want to get it into my victim process without it ever existing on disk. So with reflective DLL injection, this was one of the first forms of real, like in the wild, memory-only malware, because the idea is you have your loader inside your victim process. Very likely you're going to download the DLL over the internet from the command and control server. That network connection will be encrypted. The DLL itself will very likely be encrypted. And then the loader in the victim process, after it's done downloading the DLL, is going to decrypt it in memory and then basically replace load library. It's going to load it itself as a full DLL without ever writing it to disk. So now we have the full powers of DLLs that can launch whatever payload they want, but there's absolutely nothing on the file system about it. And because we didn't call load library, all the stuff we saw before with this and this doesn't happen. These data structures are only populated when you actually call load library. So obviously there's going to be a discrepancy here, because volatility is going to be able to say, hey, we found this DLL in memory. It's not mapped from a file on disk. It's page execute, read, write. It's not execute, write, copy. This is 100% malware. So any form of memory-only DLL injection will get detected right away. This is from a sample infected with Emotet. I feel sorry if you ever run into this into the wild. It's very nasty malware to deal with, but it stands out right away with volatility. So in this first one, we're showing you the command line plugin. So you run the plugin for every process. It's going to give you the path where the executable was run from, plus any command line arguments. Now you can look at this manually and say, hey, run DLL is running with this really crazy file path. It's under the local folder. This is obviously a scrambled file name that doesn't even end in DLL. But run DLL is going to load it anyway, and now you have this DLL loaded in memory. So you could manually look at that, but like I said, in our line of work, we regularly have dozens, hundreds, thousands of memory samples we want to get through in a couple hours, and so reading the command line output isn't really going to scale to that. So instead, with malfind, just running the plugin, not giving it any extra arguments or information, it figures out that inside of this run DLL 32, so PID 4780, there's a lot of stuff wrong. I have the snip here because I had to cut out all the other regions that were injected as well. But it's telling you there's a memory-only DLL here, so the MZ header that starts the executable. And then it's saying there's a function prologue, so it's finding shellcode right away. So again, you have 1,000 memory samples you have to get through. Malfind just points you right to the particular processes inside of all those samples that are infected. So those were the traditional techniques. Volatility 2 to some extent could do everything you saw on the last couple slides. We did update it a bit in Volatility 3, but if you've used Volatility 2, some of that probably looked familiar, versus the rest of the talk's going to look brand new because these plugins didn't exist before. What I'll talk about now is process hollowing. So this was the report I said from last week, where Google said there was this innovative, like very sophisticated malware that they caught out in the wild, and the way it hid from EDRs and from sysadmins was through process hollowing, which was great for my talk because I was already going to talk about that anyway. So the idea with process hollowing is, I mentioned before, if you inject shellcode or you inject like a memory-only DLL, that's definitely going to stand out to memory forensics, and it may or may not stand out to your EDR. What doesn't stand out as much to your EDR or to admins that are looking at a process list or manually examining system state is process hollowing. Because what we're going to do here, we're going to take an executable that already runs on the machine anyway. Something like LSAS is very common, service host is very common. Most machines already have 100 service hosts running anyway, so if you run one more, it means nothing to you, right? A sysadmin's not going to see that as suspicious. So we're going to pick on a process. In this case, we'll use LSAS, but like I said, any kind of common process works. We're going to pick on LSAS. We're going to start that process in what's known as a suspended state, and we'll have a nice diagram of this on the next slide. In the suspended state, that process is just going to set up where its executable is mapped and the first couple DLLs. So that's what this looks like here. I'm referring to this as early process hollowing because this was kind of V1. We'll get into a bunch of variants. But the idea is we're going to start lsas.exe suspended. Windows is going to set up the process for that, so a whole new process ID, all new process memory. It will map in lsas.exe. It will create the PEB, the thing that I said tracks the DLLs and a few other types of metadata. And then it's going to map in ntdll and kernel 32, and that's it. So this is kind of a half-created process. It's not ready to execute, but the process that created it, that malicious parent process that's doing the hollowing, it's going to get control again. So as a sysadmin, this is going to look like LSAS. You do Control-Alt-Delete and you see Task Manager. You ask your EDR or other system for a list of processes. It's going to say that the real LSAS, a signed executable from System32, everything's going to look right, that lsas.exe is running. But what the malware does is once it gets control back, so once it has this new process in kind of a half-created state, it's going to unmap the original lsas.exe executable and overwrite it with its own malicious code. So now you think LSAS is running, or you think another service host is running when you already have a bunch of them, but what you really have is the fully malicious code there. And you can probably guess, and this is why Google and the other ones call it out that way, the only way to detect this is inspect memory, right? Because on disk, from all your live tools, your sysinternals, and so on, it's just going to tell you LSAS is running, and you have nothing else to go on. So this is a good example. This is actually Stuxnet. so we always use it as a classic example. Stuxnet created 2 extra LSASS processes, and so on the machine, there's 3 of them running. If you're familiar with Windows internals, you know there should only be 1 LSASS. If there's multiple LSASs, besides the first one, they're all malicious. So you could look at the process list here and say, hey, these started way after some other metadata, but realistically, the malware could have changed the system clock and a bunch of other things. There's nothing definitive just looking at the process list to know the malicious one. Versus what we can do, Volatility has the new filters feature, which is super nice. So in this case, we're saying show us only, so inside the 3 LSASS processes, show us only the VADs that start at this address, the one with the zeros behind it, that's where the executable gets mapped. And so what we're looking at here, so you can see it's PID 680, PID 868, and 1928, and we're trying to figure out which one is malicious. And if you look very quickly at where the main executable is, in this one, it's execute write copy, and it maps a file. In the other 2, it's page execute read write, which doesn't make sense, and it doesn't even map a file. So in one invocation of the plugin, you can very quickly figure out that the malware is there. And so you can go from not doing memory forensics and not knowing that you have malware on the machine to run a simple plugin, and you're good to go, and you know where the malware is hiding. But this was manual, right? We had to notice the fact that, hey, there's multiple LSASS processes. We had to figure out where the main executable is. No one wants to do that across a bunch of memory samples. It doesn't really make sense. So instead, what we want is automation. So we have our Volatility plugin contest that we run every year. We still run the contest. This is not me selling you something. Instead, it's kind of the inverse. So at the end of the year, December 31st every year is the deadline. You submit to us cool plugins, cool research, cool kind of anything memory forensics related. If you win, you can take the training for free, you can get cash, you can get all the swag you want, stuff like that. So it's our way of kind of giving back to people doing research. So this HoloFind plugin is one of my favorite submissions of all time to the contest. The idea here is the researcher wrote the blog post that you see here, the detecting deceptive hollowing techniques. And then what they did is they went through every process hollowing malware there was back then, so a lot of the early stuff. They debugged it literally instruction by instruction to see how they're manipulating memory. There's a bunch of screenshots. And then they wrote the HoloFind plugin that could catch all the forms back then. So if this talk today is the first time you've heard about process hollowing or you want to learn more about it, go read this blog post. That is like the definitive early source to start. It's not short. You're probably going to have to spend like 2 hours reading it. It's basically a book, but you will be a master, an expert of this after you get through the blog post. But it was really cool. The plugin automated all that detection and made it where you could find it right away. But the other thing to realize is 2016 was 9 years ago. So when we wanted to automate this in Volatility 3, we took what was in the original HoloFind plugin, added a bunch of checks and extra heuristics that we wanted for the newer forms. And then the end result is with the new Windows.Hollow Processes plugin, you can detect any process hollowing that's out there, including the stuff Google was talking about early last week. So in this case, we're running it against that same sample infected with Stuxnet, but instead of having to manually compare the VADs and all this stuff, it tells you right away. It says, hey, the VAD, so the memory region that should be hosting the process executable, it's not actually mapping any file, and the permission's not page execute write copy, it's page execute read write. 100% malware, 100% process hollowing. So we can detect that right away. Stuxnet's obviously old, so let's look at a newer sample. Cobalt Strike from not too long ago, everyone's favorite friend to defend against, does the same exact thing. In this case, it hollowed out service host. It made it where it's page execute read write, not execute write copy, so we're going to find it right away. And then this is just based on the VADs. Remember, we can walk those DLLs as well, like you saw with DLL list. So what we're doing here is we walk the DLL list, get the path on disk, and then we cross-reference the address of where the DLL is with the VAD that's hosting it. And in this case, you can see the plugins complaining too, because it's like, hey, I found a DLL, or I found an executable in the DLL list. It's not execute write copy, it's execute read write, 100% malware, and now you know where to go look for it. The other thing is, for people who are more familiar with this type of analysis, I'm well aware that you cannot make it execute read write. You can make it totally something else and then go reallocate the pages executable later. So I added a slide just to save that question at the end. So in this case, we have a bunch of different malware. I changed up some of the names and things because these are from actual infections. But the idea is process hollowing malware. Instead of going the easy way and just making all the pages execute read write, It started off with them read-write, and then it just goes and changes the pages that need to be executable, but the plugin doesn't care. We're not looking for execute read-write. We're saying for every region that's mapping a DLL, mapping an executable, it needs to map a file, and it needs to be execute write copy, or the plugin's going to complain about it. So we're going to catch all the process hollowing techniques out there. Another thing that you'll see a lot, very, very often, is manipulation of the image base address. So this is where in kernel memory, right? So we're talking about user land malware. Kernel memory is totally off limits. So if something's in kernel memory, the malware we're trying to catch cannot change it, and we can rely on that. Versus what's in user land off the PEB, malware can do whatever it wants. It can change it at will. And one of the requirements of many types of process hollowing is changing this. You have to tell the userland runtime where the new executable is that you mapped in. So for, like with Stuxnet, you got rid of the old LSASS, you put your new executable on top of it. You have to tell that the operating system where that new executable is, or you're going to be executing in code that you just got rid of, which doesn't work out too well. So in this case, we have a discrepancy that works out really well. You have this address that is changed by malware so that its process hollowing technique can work. But then you still have the original value in the kernel that the malware has no access to. So this was the easiest check to add to the plugin. You just enumerate every process, and you say, hey, does the section base address in the kernel point to the same address as the image base address in userland? With legitimate code, they 100% of the time will always be the same exact value. With process hollowing, they will always be different, or 99% of the time they'll be different. So we detect that as well. Instead of using a real sample here, I left a link. If you want to test this yourself, you can go compile PSForge with Visual Studio, infect a virtual machine, get your memory sample that way, and then you can run volatility against it, and it should look something like this. And the plugin saying, hey, for this manage BDE process, which is what PSForge created, the PEB, so what's in userland, says one address, what's in the kernel says a different address, 100% malware. The other thing it says is, hey, we looked at where the main executable for the process should be, and there's not even a VAD there. Again, 100% process hollowing. You will never see that through legitimate means. So far, what we have is what I mentioned before. Those two invariants have caught basically every process hollowing type out there. If the memory region's not execute write copy, and it doesn't map a file, but it has an executable, that's malware. We're going to call it out. Malware can also tamper with the PEB data structures. Like I said, those are in user land. Malware can break the DLL list, but we have a whole separate plugin for that. That was in Volatility 2, works the same way. And so it will detect that as well. So really what that leaves is two ways to try to bypass this. Things that we rely on in our checks is we need to find a PE header, right? So we're looking for a DLL that was injected into a process memory only, not from disk. And then we're very heavily relying on the fact that the region needs to be execute write copy. And if it's not execute write copy, then we know it's malware. So could malware just make its memory regions execute write copy? Thankfully, Microsoft actually helps us out here for once. Usually their APIs make it easier for malware and worse for defenders. But in this case, it's the opposite. So the APIs that you use to allocate memory regions are either virtual alloc or virtual alloc EX. One of the parameters that you have to give those functions is what permissions you want on the memory region you're creating, the initial permissions. And for reasons I'm not sure, but I'm very happy about, if you look at the documentation for page execute write copy, you can't set that flag to these functions. So all the ways that malware has to create memory regions backed by a file and so on, it can't set this execute write copy bit. The only code that can do it is the kernel, and it only happens if you call load library, which is the legitimate API. So we really get saved here. We can always enforce the fact that code needs to be in a VAD that's execute write copy, and if not, the plugins will call it out like you saw over the last couple slides. So virtual alloc's not the only function to create memory regions. There's also the sections API. So this is really interesting. If you haven't seen this before, this GitHub at the bottom has code and a bunch of explanations for it. But the idea with sections are a memory region. So what you can do is your malicious process can create a memory region known as a section. You can fill that with your memory-only DLL, all the malicious code that you want, and then you can force your victim process to map that same section. And the operating system just takes the region that you created and filled with your memory-only malware, and it forces it into your victim process. So you would think this would be bad for memory forensics, because when you create the section, you can actually make it execute write copy. So you would think, okay, I could use the code down here on GitHub, bypass the hollow process technique, but you would be wrong. Because when you create a section, you can't associate it with a file. So we can see that we have a region that's page execute write copy, but the process hollowing plugin will still complain about it and detect the malware because it won't be associated with the file. So we still win that way. So I would, if you have information on how to do this outside of what the plugin's looking for, if there's some API that I've missed, then let me know. But we've never seen malware, any type of process hollowing malware that can bypass those checks, and I don't know of any APIs that can make it where you're execute write copy and mapping a file, unless you call load library, which makes 1,000 other artifacts we can find. Now the other thing, which there was a very timely blog post you'll see on the next slide, is this. So with the PE headers, remember we saw before when we ran malfind and when we saw some of the process hollowing output, it was looking for that MZ signature. Every PE file, your .exe, your .dll, is going to start with a capital M and a capital Z. So if that's overwritten, if that MZ is overwritten, the full header is overwritten, malfind will miss that in some cases. And this happens a lot because once an executable is loaded, the header doesn't matter anymore. And what the malware wants to do is make it where your AV or your EDR can't just parse that PE on the live machine and figure out that it's malicious. So what a lot of malware is going to do is overwrite their PE headers. Thankfully, we're not limited by what we can look at in memory. So instead of relying on the VADs, we're going to look at threads, because that tells us what executes. And a slide that I added literally 15 minutes before the talk, because I just found it, a blog post from like 4 or 5 days ago from Fortinet's research team. This blog post was really cool. I was reading it earlier. The title of it is a deep dive into malware without a PE header, which is exactly what this slide is talking about. You have malware executing. In the blog post, they talk about how a DLL gets injected memory only, then the PE header gets overwritten, and then they actually use volatility, like the same stuff I'm talking about right now, to get it out of memory, and then they do some extra reversing so they can get it to run again. But it's a perfect, timely example, like I said, whatever that is, 4 days ago or something, where these real threat teams are dealing with this in the wild. So I recommend reading that as well. You'll see some volatility work, plus their very detailed reverse engineering and debugging. But as I said, threads tell you where code's executing. So for every thread on Windows, there's 2 addresses that say where code's going to execute. The main way to get code initially executing is through a thread. So you tell the operating system, hey, at this address, inside of this process, I want you to treat that as code and start executing it. So if we inject shellcode, we need to point a thread to it. If we inject a memory-only DLL, we need to point a thread to where that code starts in the DLL so that it actually runs. Thankfully, this has a lot of stuff that we can use to also find malware, especially the malware that overwrites its header. So what we can do is, instead of relying on the VADs, because the VADs are only really useful if that MZ signature is there. If the header's overwritten, the VADs don't help as much initially. So instead what we can do is programmatically take all of these addresses, or at least the ones not in the kernel, take all the thread addresses, map them back to the VAD that's hosting them in their owning process, and then see what the permissions are. So you can kind of see here, this is LSAS running. It says, hey, there's this thread start address here. That's in the kernel, so there's no path. This address is inside of userland, and it's where lsas.exe is mapped. And then you see this thread's mapped inside of ntdll. This is inside of the C runtime, and so on. So the plugin's already doing this for you, so you get the nice listing of where all the DLLs are running and where the threads are running. But we can programmatically use the same API inside of Volatility that's populating the output to do our malware detection. So what we can say is, for every address that maps inside of userland, so every thread running inside of a process, we map it back to its hosting VAD. And if it's not backed by a file, it's malware. If the VAD isn't page execute write copy, it's malware. Same stuff we've been seeing. We also added an extra check. There's very interesting process hollowing techniques that, instead of unmapping the original executable, like you saw with Stuxnet, they just map in a second executable and then run from there. And the first executable stays in memory. It just never actually runs. So we check to see if processes are mapping to EXEs. And these checks are enough to catch 99% of the malware that overwrites its PE header. And then the last check we do is looking for suspended threads, which, like I said, you have to do that as kind of a prerequisite step to process hollowing. So this is another slide where I changed things around because it was from infected samples. There's not really a south.exe on Windows, but the idea is this is from real malware samples, which is why I just call it various malware. So the idea is as I mentioned, we're going through every thread, mapping it back to its VAD, and then making sure the invariants are there. So this one was really interesting. The plugin is complaining because it's saying, hey, the VAD that is hosting a thread inside of this chrome.exe process, it has an unexpected starting protection of page no access. Obviously, it needs to be execute write copy, but page no access is especially interesting because that means you can't even read from that region. So malware creates a region that if AV tries to read from it would crash the process initially. And then behind the scenes, there's a virtual protect API where the malware can go change the pages it actually needs to access, and you're not going to see that in the VAD. So you'll see quite a bit of malware allocate as page no access, but we catch it right away. This one, page execute read write, page read write. Again, anything that's not page execute write copy, if a thread is pointing to it, we're going to call it out. And then in this one, it's saying, hey, this thread's running in south.exe, there's another thread in DLL host, and the VAD that's hosting them is not backed by a file. So 100% malware, even if the header is wiped, you know that there's malicious code there. The other thing I like to call out, mostly because the project was awesome, this is one that I would definitely recommend reading the paper, but it's quite the read. So this was not a project I was involved in. It was a presentation at Black Hat Europe 2022, one of my favorite all-time Black Hat talks I watched the video of. And the idea is a project called Dirty Vanity. And what they wanted to do is bypass EDRs by performing malicious actions across processes. So let's say for simplicity's sake, because it divides by 2, to make your malicious API calls to inject the code you want to inject, you have to make 6 API calls in a row. Obviously related calls like the building blocks to inject code. So what the authors did, who did the research, is they had access to the best, most common commercial EDRs at the time. And if you just make those 6 API calls in order from the same process, as you might expect, the EDR is going to kill it off, right? It's going to detect the fact that it happened. So where this project becomes super interesting is it used what's known as cloning. So if you're not like a Unix geek, like a cloning or forking a process means creating a copy of the process that's already running. So Windows doesn't have true forking or cloning if you're used to Linux, but it has something that's close enough. So what Dirty Vanity does is you can see it kind of down here at the bottom. The original malware, it's called fake.exe if you just compile their GitHub project. It is running, and then it creates a copy of itself. So this is the PS tree plugin showing you the parent process child tree. So you have the original malware running, and it creates a copy of itself. When you create that copy, it's the same exact code and data of the original process. It's not like you're restarting fake exe from scratch. You're taking the already running process, all its code, all its data, all its handles, and putting that in a second process. And what was super interesting about the work is then what they would do, and this bypassed every single EDR at the time, which was kind of mind-blowing to me, is remember, let's say we have to call 6 APIs, because that divides by 2. They would make the first 3 API calls from the parent, and then the child has the same exact handles that it needs to make those API calls. And the second set of calls, the final 3, would be made from the child. And not a single EDR could figure out the fact that this code injection happened because it was split across 2 processes. So super technical. If you like really Windows internals, OS internals, like I said, one of my favorite research projects I read out of Black Hat. But we obviously wanted to detect this. The only reason I read these things and find them fun is because I want to write a volatility plugin to detect them after. So this led to the Windows.suspended threads plugin. What I figured out as I was researching Dirty Vanity is that when it creates the second process, Windows creates the second child process suspended, because otherwise it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If you start the process and let its main thread run, it's like you're restarting the process from scratch. So I wrote a plugin that looks at every thread of every process, and if that thread is suspended, it reports it. And right away, you can see it's reporting fake.exe with PID 6752, which is the child that's created to bypass the EDRs. And so again, add that to your list of things to read. And now with volatility, anything based on that, we can detect it right away. The other thing that I realized as we were doing this, at Volatility, we have a data set of 400 something Windows memory samples with like base installs, just third-party applications, plus obviously a bunch of malware. And I ran this plugin across that entire sample set, and it was awesome. It had 0 false positives, and all it found was dirty vanity, which is what I was trying to catch. And it also caught a bunch of process hollowing techniques that I wasn't familiar with, so I went back and reversed them after, because there's process hollowing techniques that will create the process to be hollowed, suspended, and then never resume it. They just run their own code after the fact. So we ended up catching malware that I didn't know we were going to catch that way, when really I just wanted to catch dirty vanity. So if you're looking for hollowed processes, run the hollow processes plugin, run this one, and you'll be in a really good spot. The last thing I'll talk about in the last few minutes is just really cool code injection techniques that don't involve the VADs and the threads. So realistically, some like red teamers who want to bypass EDRs in their investigations or in their work, but then also real malware and also some pretty sophisticated ransomware that was found in the wild. They wanted to avoid the fact of creating VADs, creating threads leads to detection. You just saw how volatility picks up on that right away. So a lot of really intense like Windows internals were used, and the results were pretty cool. So the idea is malicious code is running on the machine. They're not even trying to hide the fact that the executable is malicious or that the code is malicious in memory. Instead, what they're doing is making it where AVs and EDRs can't even scan the process, because then you can run whatever you want because no one's going to see it anyway. So one of the things they rely on for this is they're able to abuse the transaction system, so like NTFS transactions, to create processes that are marked as deleted, which is really weird. So the operating system's running, but it thinks it's running from a deleted file. And if your AV or your EDR tries to open a handle to it to then read the contents of the file from disk, the operating system just blocks it. So there's no way to read the contents of the file from disk, even though it's running as a process. And so this, as you might expect, bypasses quite a bit of detection on the live machine. This is incredibly loud from memory forensics, though, so I ended up writing the Windows.process ghosting plugin after researching all of these. It's really like 4 or 5 different techniques, all different variants of basically getting a deleted process to run, but they all end up making the same very strange artifacts in memory. So looking at like the VADs, you see where a process is running from not a file, which it's hard to say because it just doesn't make sense, so we can detect that. We look at all the VADs that map EXEs or DLLs. If they're deleted, also doesn't make sense, we detect that. And as you'll see quickly here with Cobalt Strike, it uses the API for being delete on close, which means once that process is no longer running, the executable gets deleted. So I'll go through these kind of quick, only have a few minutes left, but this is versus what's known as transacted hollowing. So abusing NTFS transactions to have a hollowed process. Leaves a lot of side effects. You can see the process is named talc.exe, so that was what was being hollowed. But because of abusing transactions, you end up running as this really weird temp file that the operating system creates. And then on top of all of that, the delete pending bit is set, which means, hey, my process is running from a file that's deleted, which I know that's totally fine to do on Linux, but it's not something that should be supported on Windows. So the plugin catches it right away. This is the initial process ghosting technique, where you're trying to, again, run a process that's like deleted. In this case, the technique ends up where when you look at the VAD that should host the executable, it has a path, but it doesn't have an object, which makes absolutely 0 sense. So you can see here it's saying, hey, the file object is 0. You never see that with legitimate code. And then we catch the same process twice, because this is looking at the VADs, and we're saying, hey, this VAD mapping the executable has its delete pending bit set. So right away, you can run this across all the samples you want, and if you get any output, it's bad. If you don't get any output, it's good. This is Cobalt Strike. Like I said, it will run executables. I hate to say by default, because it's very configurable, but in many cases, you end up where the process executable is running with the delete on close bit set. So again, what that means is when the process exits, the executable that's running will be deleted by the operating system. So I put this as the last slide because it's also a perfect example of why you need to do memory forensics, right? Because say you're a sysadmin and you see a process running called HTTPS beacon, you'd probably rename that in the wild. but you see some weird process running, and you're like, I'm going to kill that process. I'm going to terminate it in Task Manager. What you just did by doing that is not only getting rid of all the memory artifacts, as soon as that process terminates, the operating system just deleted the malware for you, and you're not going to see it. So again, walk up to a machine, get a memory sample, and then approach it that way. So in conclusion, traditional code injection techniques, even Volatility 2 would catch them, but we tweaked malfind a little bit. And now you saw we have a bunch of new plugins to catch all the new stuff. For EDR evasion, I spoke at DEF CON last year, ended up writing like a 20-page white paper documenting every EDR bypass that was out there. And then that YouTube link is the hour-long talk going through very similar to this, like nothing that was here though, like all new volatility plugins, all new capabilities, but much more like Windows internals and exactly how EDRs get bypassed so often. So with that, I can take any questions. Feel free to email me or add me on LinkedIn or anything like that. And if you want to read about the new release of Volatility, I have the link to the blog post about it, so you can get all the new code and new plugins. And thank you for coming out.